From the time of the Revolution, the Army's been organized into traditional European branches of service such as infantry, artillery, cavalry, and engineers. Since World War II, the Army branches have become identified in three groups: combat arms, combat support, and combat service support. And today we're going to take a look at the combat arms branches. Hello and welcome to Veterans Medals Workshop. We're glad to have you with us today, and we have a great show on the 7 combat arms of the United States Army. You're going to take a look at each one of the officer and non-commissioned officer insignia, and I hope to show you exactly where they are on the uniform. The Army after World War II repositioned itself as combat arms, combat support, and combat service support. And today, there are almost 30 different branches in the Army. But the key ones, the key 7 combat arms branches are the infantry, the air defense artillery, the field artillery, armor, the cav, which is not really a branch, but it can be like a branch, or at least they can wear the insignia sometimes, aviation, special forces, and of course, the Corps of Engineers. They not only build things, but they blow things up. So we'll go and take a look. Don't let me forget to say thank you to Medals of America down in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, for providing all of the insignia you're going to see today. And everything you're going to see today came from the book, United States Army Military Medals, Badges, and Insignia. It's available for you on Amazon, and probably the best reference in the world. It's the most complete guide to all Army military medals, badges, and insignia, and the ribbons too. I highly recommend it. Well, what the hell, I wrote it. So let's go take a look. The Army's been using combat arms insignia for well over 200 years, and I wanted to give you just a little example of how they've been wearing them since World War I. On your left is a World War I uniform, and on the right-hand collar of a soldier was a round disc, which was a national disc with the U.S. on it, and on his left collar was a round disc with his branch insignia on it. The uniform in the center is a World War II officer, and he wore the national insignia, a U.S., on each lapel, as well as his branch insignia as shown here. On the enlisted soldiers of World War II, they wore a round disc on the right lapel, which had a U.S., and on the left lapel, they wore a round disc with the branch insignia on it. In the Vietnam-era green uniform, the enlisted men wore a round disc on their right lapel with the national insignia, a U.S., and on their left lapel, a round disc with the branch insignia. In this case, the first sergeant is wearing an infantry insignia. On today's current blue uniform, it is the same setup. On the right lapel goes the national insignia for enlisted personnel, and on the left lapel goes the branch insignia, as shown here. On today's blue uniform, you can see the infantry insignia is worn on the lapel below the U.S., as shown here, and on the new green uniform, or should I say the new World War II uniform, the branch insignia will be worn just as shown here, the U.S. on the upper part of the lapel, the branch insignia on the lower part. And female officers wear their branch insignia the same as male officers on the lapel of their dress uniform. Branch insignia is not worn on the lapel of mess dress uniforms. Here, an artillery officer has red lapels, which is the traditional artillery color. Adjutant general officer had black, and the female officer is wearing aviation blue lapels. For enlisted personnel, the branch insignia will continue to be worn on the left lapel of the blue uniform and the left lapel of the new World War II version of the Army Greens. Here's an example of female soldiers, and they will also continue to wear the branch insignia on the left lapel of their dress uniform. We're looking at the 7 combat arms branches of the Army alphabetically, so we're going to start with the Air Defense Artillery branch. And they have no shortage of big toys. The Air Defense Artillery insignia is shown here. The officer's insignia on the left is a missile vertical over 2 crossed field guns, all in a gold-colored metal. The enlisted insignia is the same, just mounted on a circular disc, and on your right is the Air Defense Artillery plaque, which almost every branch has one of. From World War I up to 1957, Air Defense Artillery members wore the same basic field artillery branch insignia, which was 2 cross cannons. But in 1957, this new insignia of a crossed field gun surmounted by a missile was adapted, and in 1968, the Air Defense Artillery was established as a basic branch of the Army and became authorized to retain the former artillery insignia with the crossed field guns and the missile. Armor is the next combat arms branch. Clank, clank, I think I hear a tank. The armor branch insignia that you see today is a front view of an M26 tank, gun slightly raised, superimposed over two crossed cavalry sabers and scabbards, cutting edge up in gold-colored metal. It was approved in 1950, and I'll show you to the original armor branch insignia just below in a moment. The officer branch insignia is shown on the left, and the enlisted branch insignia is shown on the right. The traditional crossed sabers were originally adopted for the cavalry in 1851, and with the M26 tank superimposed, the design symbolizes the traditional and the current role of armor. In the lower left-hand corner is the 1917 Tank Corps insignia that was worn on the collar. It was very unpopular. It was a front view of a French tank, and that was later changed to the Mark 8 tank. Side view is shown on the far right in the bottom right-hand corner. Around 1933, that was changed again, so it was the Mark 8 tank superimposed over crossed infantry rifles. And then later in 1940s, the tank destroyer units got an M3 chassis with a 75-millimeter gun mounted on it as a collar insignia. All of those became obsolete by the end of World War II. Army Aviation. The sound of helicopters in the morning. And in the evening. From 1914 to 1947, Army Aviation was the Army Air Force, and you can see the Army Air Force insignia on the left, both for officers and enlisted. Prior to 1983, Army aviators wore the branch that they were originally commissioned in, so you could be an armor officer or an infantry officer and be a pilot. But in 1983, Army Aviation became a basic branch of the Army and a combat arms. And the idea was to keep the basic design of the Army Air Force wings or insignia and draw upon the original insignia for historical and symbolic purposes, so that it was deliberately modified to signify a new chapter in Army aviation history. And that brings us to the cavalry, which is not a branch except when it wants to be, or when it's a cavalry unit. So pay attention, this is testable. Cavalry insignia is shown here, officer on the left and enlisted on the right, is two crossed sabers and scabbards cutting edge up. The cavalry insignia was adopted in 1851. And today, officers and enlisted personnel assigned to cavalry regiments, cavalry squadrons, or separate cavalry troops are authorized to wear the cavalry collar insignia in lieu of their insignia of branch when approved by a major Army commander. And there's some armor and aviation units that are also designated cavalry units. In 1901, the artillery was divided into the coast and the field artillery, and the branch insignia was modified to what you see here for the coast artillery. Two cross field guns, gold-colored metal with a scarlet oval with a gold projectile at the intersection of the field guns. Shown on the right is the Army Mine Planter Service, which was authorized to wear this insignia with a mine case below the insignia of the coastal artillery in 1920. The Army Reorganization Act of 1950 consolidated the coast and field artillery to form the artillery arm, and the cross cannons became the designated insignia, and this became obsolete. This brings us to the Corps of Engineers, which not only gets to build things, but it gets to blow up things. The Corps of Engineers insignia is shown here, officers on the left, enlisted on the right. It's a gold-colored triple-turret castle. The triple-turret castle has been used by the Corps of Engineers since it was adopted in 1840. Prior to that time, a similar insignia was worn on the uniform of the cadets at the military academy since they were under the direction of the Chief of Engineers. Selection of the turreted castle as the engineer insignia followed the first major construction undertaken by the Corps of Engineers. That is, they were building a system of castle-like fortifications for many of the harbors along the Atlantic coast. These fortifications, many of them are still standing, and in fact called castles. By 1924, the insignia had evolved into the current design in the gold color. Other branches of the combat arms have individual regimental insignias, but the Corps of Engineers does not have any regiments, and so it operates under the whole branch concept of a regiment, and the whole branch regimental insignia is shown on the far right. One of the oldest combat arms dating back to 1775 is the field artillery, and here is one of its mainstays, the M109 self-propelled 155mm howitzer. It's been around 50 or 60 years. Here's a picture of my unit up on the Czech border in 1965. We didn't have color photography back then. Today, the field artillery insignia consists of 2 cross field guns, gold in color. And these cross cannons have been in continuous use since 1834, when they were placed on regimental colors, knapsacks, or part of a cap insignia for artillery officers. As I mentioned earlier, in 1901, the artillery was divided into the coast artillery and the field artillery, and then it was later consolidated back into the field artillery. In the 50s, the insignia was changed for a consolidation of artillery and air defense, and the cross cannons had a missile in the middle. But in 1968, air defense became its own branch, and the original field artillery insignia, as you see here, were reinstated. And that brings us to the mighty combat arms, the Queen of Battle, the infantry, shown here in the mechanized format. And if you don't think they're Bradley's pack a punch, check out the uranium-depleted rounds they carry. Awesome. Of course, some infantry units aren't mechanized. They get to fly into battle, which is a pretty cool way to get there. But then I have to point out, if you're airborne infantry, your load might be just a little heavier. Infantry has been the queen of battle since the days of the Romans. The first infantry insignia used in the American Army was a brass hunting horn designed for rifle regiments. The cross muskets were first introduced into the Army as the insignia of officers and enlisted men of the infantry in 1875. There were numerous attempts early on to keep the insignia current with whatever new rifle came up, but in 1924, the branch insignia was standardized by the adopting of the crossed 1795 model Springfield Arsenal muskets. The officer's insignia is shown on the left, the enlisted insignia is shown on the right, and the enlisted infantrymen are often authorized the special privilege of wearing a light blue backing behind their branch insignia, as shown on the right. The Special Forces get lots of really cool equipment, but they also get to be deployed 6 to 7 months out of the year. The Special Forces insignia shown here is 2 crossed Indian arrows in gold. The officers is shown on the left, the enlisted is shown in the center. The branch insignia was authorized in 1987 for wear by personnel of the Special Forces branch. Previous to that, 1984, it was authorized for wear by enlisted personnel in the Special Forces operations. Originally from 1890 to 1926, crossed arrows were prescribed for wear by Indian scouts, and during World War II, the crossed arrows were worn as collar insignia by the officers and enlisted personnel assigned to the 1st Special Forces. The insignia on the far right is the regimental insignia for the Special Forces. It's a silver-colored metal and enamel device consisting of a pair of silver arrows crossed, point up, and surmounted at their junction by a silver dagger with a black handle pointed up. A black motto scroll at the base is inscribed in Latin, and that translates as "liberated from oppression" in silver letters. Thanks for joining us today for our show on the 7 branches of the combat arms. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, please give us a like, even better subscribe, and look forward to having you back with us on Veterans Medals Workshop. There's about 70 or 80 more videos out there like this, so please go and take a look. We're making them just for you. Okay, see you next time.